Hey all, I'm TP Lemon, and recently I've been considering making some content for Final Fantasy XIV, and I plan to give it a fair shot. Now, this is my first video in my Wishlist series, and in this series, I want to provide feedback to the devs, come up with decently thought out ideas um, based on that feedback, and communicate to the devs what I would absolutely love to see in a game. Now, obviously, I am not a game dev, so and I don't want to assume my own ideas are like amazing. And let's be honest, we all come up with ideas that in our head seem amazing, but then you tell a friend about that idea, and then that friend asks a question, and you realize exactly how idiotic your idea actually is. So for all I know, my ideas might be shit. But look, the important point isn't actually what that specific idea is. It's the gist of what led me to create and consider that idea in the first place. So, and my hope is at least if game devs ever see this video, I hope that they'll at least get the thinking behind some of my ideas and understand what as a long-time player of Final Fantasy that I would love to see added to the game in 8.0. And obviously today the topic at hand is Summoner. So Summoner, man, this job has history. Because in Shadowbringers, it was this really interesting class that has a super lengthy rotation, and you needed to spreadsheet the whole rotation, and it has over like multiple minutes. And understandably, it had to be simplified. I think most players agree with that. They changed it to its current form, and imagine most will agree that the current summoner is overly simple and bland. You summon Bahamut like every minute, and then there's an Aphid, Garuda, Titan in between, and honestly, in most cases, summoning them in whatever random order doesn't even really matter that much. And when you summon these three, you spam Gem Shine. It's just the single button that changes based on what primal you summon. And that tag uses primal charges and accompanied by OGCD. Honestly, it's very relaxing if you're having a bad day, you don't want to think too much. And I definitely have days like that, but you cannot deny that for most, it quickly becomes very boring, sleep-inducing gameplay. Now, Yoshi P himself has mentioned in an interview that he feels that combat in Final Fantasy has gotten too stress-free, a bit stale, to the point where he himself feels like dozing off in some of the easier dungeons. Now, he might not be talking specifically about Summoner, but Summoner gameplay definitely fits into that description, if you ask me. All right, so let's have a framework in which we can work with when it comes to feedback and suggesting potential ideas, right? Because it's pointless for me or anyone to ask for, I don't know, Shadowbringer Summoner to return, yeah? Because that's just not going to happen, let's be honest. But if we have a framework of, what the philosophy of Summoner is, what the devs might want to direct Summoner toward, Creative Studio 3's intentions with the class, then, if we provide feedback based on that, there's an increased potential of Creative Studio 3 devs actually considering those suggestions and that feedback. So, yeah, first of all, we need to acknowledge, right, that they want Summoner to be an approachable job. Like that's they've stated that repeatedly. And here's my opinion: is that I think the class can be approachable to the casual player base and still have a lot more skill expression for a veteran player and a much higher mastery ceiling. And I have a few ideas on how to do that. Second, it's important to address the current balance issues within the caster role. So for those who have kept up with the game, we all know Pictomancer has a huge advantage in fights that have a lot of downtime because of how the motif mechanic works. You can cast, it doesn't actually do any damage, but it preps the class to do damage. So when those long casting motifs are casted during a downtime after a boss jumps away, a Pictomancer really shines, and I think we need to give someone something to account for that advantage that Pictomancer has. Okay, so we also know Summoner's damage is significantly lower, and we can take a look at like FF logs, and it's obvious across every single fight, especially the most recent ultimate, Futures Rewritten. And the explanation provided for this by the team, I don't know, I can't find exactly where is, or maybe this is just a sentiment that exists throughout the community, is that Summoner's brain-dead rotation combined with the ability to res other players is the reason for the significantly lower damage. But look, here's the issue, right? In harder encounters with loads of body checks, like that res is almost useless. It's kind of like in a way as a summoner you punish you're punished for basically nothing within harder content, which I think absolutely sucks for players who love Summoner. I mean, you can still say, like, well, technically, Summoner can clear all content, but if its damage is so much lower to the point where the whole community frowns at its use in some of the harder, higher end content, I just think that should be avoided if you're capable, if you can like just adjust your design concept. Like, I really think that should be avoided. So, and last of all, like Yoshi P himself has stated, for example, in this translated interview, he stated he wants classes to have more identity in 8.0. So that's the framework we're trying to think and consider ideas within. That at least I am trying to. All right, so let's get started. And here are my ideas that can be built on the current Summoner design, which is my 8.0 wish list for Summoner, essentially. So first of all, I'm thinking, look, we can have more primals, right? Not just 3. We can have, like, for example, 6 primals, 1 for each element. That would be really cool. We can have, for example, elemental advantage, building bonus. We can have simple, meaningful pet management. And the reason I really think this should be in the game is there are MMO players who love having a pet and love pet gameplay, and to not have any pet management, not have any class that has that type of gameplay, it's like you're losing players, right? You're completely shoving aside the segment of MMO players that enjoy this gameplay. And obviously, and then next, to build on that, we have pet synergy attacks. The Summoner works with a pet to create synergy attacks, not just some extra button you can press. And then 5th, elemental modification. Now, this is a complex idea that I will add in at the end. I doubt it'll be applicable to Final Fantasy XIV, but I'm just throwing it there for potential future whatever. Yeah. So let me elaborate on each of these ideas. Okay. So starting with the first 2, because the first 2 ideas are linked. So for those who have played other Final Fantasies, using effective elements for combat is pretty standard, and I think a lot of players do like that. And I'm sure a lot of people has also played games like Pokemon, where elements matters, and obviously this is a MMO. Final Fantasy is MMO, so for balance sake, you can't have stuff like for example, Black Mage 5/4 doing 0 damage to Ifrit. You can't have that. But luckily for Summoner, there are primals, and in the game, in the lore, there exists primals of each element. And so if you can have a primal of every single element, then obviously you can start have some elemental bonus interaction. But that's precisely why we need to first give summoners the ability to summon a primal of each of the primary elements within Final Fantasy lore. So we already have Ifrit, we have Titan, and we have Garuda. So let's add the other 3 elements: Ramuh for lightning, Essence of Shiva for ice, and Leviathan for water. Now, I would also at this point want to shift Phoenix out of the every 1 minute burst. Right now it kind of stays. It's usually you summon Bahamut and then Luna Bahamut, and then Phoenix randomly shows up every once in a while. Let's move Phoenix out of the 1 minute and lock Resurrection behind it. Now, the reason I suggest this is, as I mentioned previously, summoners the damage is pushed downwards because of the Resurrection, and I really don't. And Resurrection isn't that useful in higher end content. Anyways, so let's just put it behind Phoenix and put Phoenix behind a normal primal gem summon between the 2 Bahamut summons every 1 minute, and that allows Summoner to have a higher damage ceiling and be more relevant in higher end content. Okay, so let's try flush out these newer primals. All right, currently we have 1 gem to summon Ifrit, 1 to summon Titan, and 1 for Garuda, right? So how about this? Instead, we have 3 non-aspected gems. And with these 3 gems, you can summon 3 out of the 7 total primals in between every 1 minute burst. Alright, so out of the 7, which is Ifrit, Titan, Garuda, Manifestation of Shiva, Ramuh, Leviathan, and Phoenix, which has Resurrection locked behind it. Okay, so let me explain my reasoning behind this, right? So first of all, I mean, think about it from the casual player's perspective. Now you have all these primals that a casual player can, pick 3 out of. And so a casual player can essentially pick their favorite summons to use, their favorite primals to use. So I think this is great. And obviously there's also a lot more variety in maybe the animation, colors, what primal we summon. That's just really cool, I think. Now, second of all, the goal is to also to raise the mastery ceiling for the class while maintaining the simple rotation. So if you imagine, Ifrit, Titan, and Garuda already has, each has something that they do a bit better. Now you have, 3 other summons, Ramuh, Shiva, and Leviathan. And if these three additional summons are designed to have, their own advantage, depending on the situation, now that really raises the mastery ceiling for veterans to really, think about which primal they want to use in different situations. And so, since we want to maintain, a approachable gameplay, right? So, easy rotation, if you want to put it that way. We want to maintain Bahamut, 3 primals, and then on the Bahamut, then, the best way to introduce mastery ceiling is to give players choices on what to summon, and to make it so that those choices matter. And having 6 primals, each with different strengths, you choose 3 of them in between each Bahamut burst phase. That's a great way of raising the mastery ceiling without making the general rotation overly difficult to the casual player. Now, all this is said, provided that these additional summons have their unique strengths. And so we can try to do that, right? Like let's take a Ramuh, for example. With Ramuh, we can give it a downtime mechanic where you can convert your primal charges, the charges that you use on the skill Gemshine. We can give Ramuh the ability to convert those charges into an installed lightning ball attack when the boss jumps away. So now Summoner has Ramuh as a potential downtime mechanic that they can use when the boss exits the arena. And this allows Summoner to close the gap with Pictomancer and strike a better balance, right? Because Pictomancer, as I mentioned before, has a huge advantage in downtime fights. Now, another example is, for example, Leviathan. We know in the Leviathan Extreme, the Leviathan does a lot of line jumps across the arena. So maybe we can give it a line AoE attack. That's a gain on 2 targets. So under certain situations, Leviathan might be the optimal primal to summon with your primal gem. For Shiva, I haven't really thought out clearly what Shiva might do, but maybe you can have some fun ice skating sliding around skill that's difficult but rewarding to use under certain scenarios. And as I mentioned before, Phoenix, let's just not even bother including it in the 1-minute burst because it shows up so rarely, and just put it as something that's summoned by a primal gem in between 1-minute burst. Lock Resurrection behind that summon so that whenever summoners have to actually rest someone, there's an opportunity cost of a primal gem. And so now, that I think that means that Summoner no longer gets the damage, no longer gets punished in terms of damage because they happen to have a rest, because now it's locked behind a primal gem. Okay, so if we look at the whole situation, right? A casual player, they can now summon whatever they like, a bit of extra damage here and there doesn't really matter in most situations. But for a veteran player, they can, if they have good fight knowledge and they really want to optimize, they can find out which summons are the best in whatever situations, and they can summon those, right? So that's raising the mastery ceiling. And we think about the overall rotation, right? Nothing has changed really. You're still summoning a Bahamut every minute. You're summoning 3 primals, 3 elementary primals in between those 2 Bahamuts. You're spamming Gemshine. And ultimately, it's what the player chooses to summon out of those elementary primals that is the expression of skill and knowledge. Okay, so that's the first 2. That's the first idea, and into the second idea that builds upon the 6 elements. As I mentioned before, we want some elemental bonus, elemental advantage bonus. So here's the Final Fantasy elemental chart based on the lore. And if we look at this chart, I know some of you might look at this and think it's a bit silly because, like for example, for some reason water doesn't really have an effect on fire and they split apart. But let's just use it for now because it's part of the Final Fantasy lore and the world metaphysics. I mean, I guess you could argue technically that fire turns water into steam, so I just say, but okay. But anyway, look, let's take a look at the first one on the left. Wind beats fire beats ice, and ice beats wind. Okay, so before we jump into the how my idea exactly works, let's break it down into percentages, and then I will provide some examples to illustrate my idea. And the basic idea is any elemental bonus damage is stored and applied to the next Bahamut summoned during the 1 minute burst. And when you summon in the right order, you get elemental advantage of 2%. If you summon in elementally neutral flow, that's a 1% bonus. And if you summon in the wrong direction of the elemental chart, that's an elemental disadvantage of, and that's essentially 0%, right? Because elemental disadvantage. And you obviously summon 3 primals, so you have 2 steps, right? 2 steps between 3 primals. So total, if the stored damage bonus is 3 to 4%, Lunar Bahamut shows up in the next 1 minute burst. If the stored damage is 1 to 2%, normal Bahamut is summoned instead. Okay, so I know this might be a bit confusing right now, but it'll be obviously once I go through the examples. All right, so at the start of the rotation, we summon Bahamut or Lunar Bahamut, and now we have 3 primal gems and we summon 3 primals. Okay, so let's look at the very first line here, the first example. Imagine if we summon Ifrit first. Right now, Ifrit is fire base, and based on the elemental chart, wind beats fire. So if we summon Garuda after Ifrit, remember wind beats fire, the summoner will get an advantage, an elemental advantage. So that stored damage, there will be a stored damage buff of 2%, right? Which will be applied to the next Bahamut phase. Now here's the thing, right? Now Garuda is out. What beats wind? Ice beats wind. So if you summon Shiva after Garuda, you get another 2% damage bonus. So now after these 3 elemental summons from your 3 primal gems, after summoning these 3, you've built a total of 4% bonus damage applied to the next Lunar Bahamut cycle. All right, that's the first example. So I hope you're following my idea, because I'm not 100% certain whether how good my explanation is. So second example. Okay, let's say we're summoning Ramuh first. Now we know Earth beats lightning, so if you summon Titan after Ramuh, right, you gain a 2% stored damage bonus. Now in this example, second example, let's go off the track. Let's not follow elemental advantage bonuses. Okay. Let's assume, okay, after you've summoned Titan after Ramuh, now mechanics are happening, and you need to use a gap closer to maybe get into the middle of a donut AOE around the boss, let's say, right? So you need Ifrit. So you summon Ifrit instead, so you gap close right to the boss, and dodge into the donut AOE, the safe spot in the middle of the donut AOE. Now Ifrit is fire. Now fire and earth is neutral according to the Final Fantasy 14 elemental chart. So now it's not a 2% gain. Because it's elementally neutral, it's just a 1% gain. Now in this second line, this second example, right, we end up with a total of 3% damage bonus applied on the next Lunar Bahamut. Alright, and that 1%, you could say, so it's worth sacrificing if it means with Ifrit you can dodge in to do some important key mechanics of a fight. Third example, okay, let's say you summon Leviathan first because it does line AoE, right? That's useful for ad phase. And then you choose to summon Garuda because Garuda also has pretty good AoE. It has the dropped AoE, dot on the ground. Pretty good option for ads. Now, Leviathan's water, Garuda is wind. That's a neutral elemental flow. So that's a 1% bonus. And let's say after Garuda, once it came into a gap close, and you summon Ifrit. The issue is, of course, wind beats fire. So if you summon Ifrit does not beat Garuda. So that's disadvantage. That's a disadvantageous elemental flow, which will add no elemental bonus damage. So total, you end up with 1% additional damage applied to the next Bahamut summon. Obviously, because this is 1%, you summon Bahamut, you don't summon Lunar Bahamut. Now, to make this whole process simpler, for example, and approachable for casuals, right? You can make it so that, the correct elemental flow, the correct primal for an advantageous elemental flow lights up. And this is as illustrated. And this is something that already exists in game. For example, if you've played Viper, or you've played Dancer, when certain skills can be used, there's a dotted line that spins around the icon of the skill. And so we can easily do this so that a casual approaching summoner can see which primal they need to summon next to get that advantageous damage elemental bonus. On the other hand, right, a veteran, even if they see this, lighting up of a certain primal to summon next, they can choose not to follow that flow. Right? If they know a specific primal is more effective for certain situations of a fight, useful for certain mechanics, they can forego, a 1 to 2% damage buff. So, but by now, you can see what I'm going for, right? So, in combination, these two ideas combined together, you have your rotation is still the same, right? Your rotation is still the same. You're still summoning Bahamut. You're still summoning 3 elemental primals in between the 1 minute burst. But now, you're picking 3 out of 7 primals to summon. The order in which you summon them will give you a bonus damage to the next 1 minute Bahamut burst. And every single primal will have its strengths, so that there might be situations under which you forego that elemental bonus because a certain primal is better for a certain situation. So for casual, that's approachable. For veteran, that's that adds many more degrees of mastery, that raises the mastery ceiling. I think a lot of RPG players will enjoy a bit of this elemental gameplay. I think it's really cool that now you can summon 6 primals. That's really cool for casual players, even if they don't care about optimizing. And it gives a really strong identity. It gives someone a really strong identity that no other class in Final Fantasy currently has. Okay, so that's the general rotation idea, that the overall rotation that I'm suggesting. But obviously, the important thing is why I suggested these ideas. It's really to keep the rotation pretty simple, approachable, while raising the mastery ceiling for veteran players and giving space for skill expression. Okay, now on to the third idea, pet management. Now, I know some players don't like managing a pet, but and also know, for example, in Shadowbringers, pets sometimes die from boss raid wides, and obviously we don't want that, right? Because that it can be quite very annoying, trying repeatedly summoning a pet that keeps dying in a fight. So I'm quite aware that if a pet management gets way too out of hand, it can be just too much. So I try my best to keep this idea simple but meaningful. Right, simple but meaningful. Now, even if you don't like pet management yourself, right, you cannot deny the fact that a significant portion of MMO players do enjoy some pet management. It's been a huge part of many MMO games in the past. And it's a very popular gameplay style as well. So once again, I said before, and I'll say again because this cannot be more emphasized. Frankly, in my opinion, it's a horrible business decision to not have any proper pet gameplay in Final Fantasy XIV. And I myself have heard that some players quit the game when they discovered Summoner doesn't really have any proper pet gameplay. And some players might even look at Final Fantasy and XIV and they ask themselves, is there a class where there's some interesting pet gameplay? And they see, oh, there's no any pet gameplay, and they just don't come. And so, in my opinion, Square Enix is essentially losing a player base, completely alienating a player base because they don't have a single pet class. A proper pet class, right? Not just some glamour pet class. Okay, so this third idea of mine, right, is to provide a possible solution for this glaring issue. So right off the bat, let's split Summoner's Carbuncle from the Primal summons. For those who don't know, the Carbuncle disappears when the Summoner summons a Primal, which is, so if we want to have pet gameplay, which is with the Carbuncle, we need to split it apart first. Okay, so let's assume that's split apart. And we also don't want the Carbuncle dying to random raid wides. So let's make it so that the Carbuncle, just like currently, the Carbuncle doesn't have any health and it's basically immortal. It can't die. Once you summon it, it just never dies. Alright, so onto the mechanics of how to make this pet management simple, but meaningful. Okay, so let's keep it simple, right? Let's give the carbuncle 2 modes. There's a melee mode and range mode. For the melee mode, we can make it so that the attack is essentially a pulsing AoE, maybe every 3 seconds, or maybe tied to the GCD of the summoner of the player themselves. Okay, so let's have. So in this diagram, this is a M6S arena. The reason I'm using this is I will be demonstrating how this works in the M6S fight after initial explanation. So carbuncle melee mode. 200 potency in the inner circle, 160 potency on the outer ring. Okay, so let's start with that. Range mode. Here's the range mode. Super thin long cone attack with a really long range. The far range does 200 potency. Close range, 160 potency. All right, now I'm sure some of you have already thought of this. All right, what if we move this pet and that interrupts its auto attack? Right, that can create really janky situations. So let's make it so that it's just a pulsing damage, meaning no matter what happens, no matter how you move the pet, the damage will pulse outwards. In melee mode, in this circular inner and outer ring. For range mode, this thin cone line where the further section does more damage. So this keeps it pretty simple to manage and avoids any jankiness. Okay, so some of you by now probably already know exactly what I'm going for. And you probably can already envision what I'm going for, but let me give you an example. And I'll be using Mr. Happy's clear footage of M6S. And thanks to Mr. Happy for putting this up. Okay, so let's take a look at Mr. Happy's M6S clear video, very well-known streamer in FF14. So as you can see, we can, in this situation, right, we can put the pet, the carbuncle, on the bottom right of the screen, put it on range mode, and you cleave the ad on the right side of the middle of the screen, and also the ads at the top of the screen with the Kono AoE. That's something you can do, right? Now there are obviously other options. So what's the other option? You might be thinking to yourself, oh, that cone is pretty narrow, right? So that cone might not hit all the ads on the top of the screen. So you have the option of putting your carbuncle on the top of the screen, putting it in melee mode, and that way you ensure that AoE your carbuncle will hit all the ads on the top of the screen, right? Because there is a possibility that your narrow cone might not hit some of the ads that might, due to positioning or whatever, might fall outside of a cone. So that's something you can consider, right? That's an option. All right, so as you can see, this melee and range mode, this pet management gives the players a lot of freedom and flexibility on how to move the pet around to do optimal damage in savage fights and more. Now obviously there's a problem of war bosses, which I plan to address with pet synergy attacks in the next idea, but let's focus on the current idea. With this gameplay, right, veterans can really think about how to position the pets, move the pet around to get that optimization game damage. And for casuals who don't like pet management, they can be lazy, right? They can just park the pet at the back of the arena in range mode, and at the cost of a bit of damage. But that's the point, right? The point is we want to keep the summoner gameplay pretty easy for a casual player, pretty approachable, while giving veterans, a higher mastery ceiling. And that's basically the thinking behind this idea of pet management. Simple, meaningful, with potential for a ceiling for players who are willing to engage with the system. All right, so on to the next idea, pet synergy. And as I mentioned before, adding an extra button onto the hotbar. For example, just adding an extra button for the summoner to order a pet to use a special attack. That's kind of lame. Let's be honest here. That's just an extra button on the hotbar to press. So I think that would be uninteresting. So I've come up with an idea that truly impacts gameplay. It's not just an extra button press. Okay. So before we jump into how the gameplay might actually be, I need to add a few buttons. So first button. So what the skill does is the summoner teleports to pet position. Right? Okay. Second additional skill. Teleport your pet to a position on the arena. Third button. Summoner and pet swap positions with each other. Alright? Now let's add the synergy attacks. The fourth skill, melee synergy attack. I mean, potency is like whatever, but for example, let's go with 1200 potency, 2 charges. So, you have some freedom on when you choose to use this attack. Summoner and pet must be within 2 yards of each other. And this is making a guaranteed crit direct, just for the sake of it. Fifth button, range synergy attack. 1200 potency, small AoE. Midway, midpoint between the summoner and pet. And summoner and pet must be at least 10 yards away from each other. Once again, let's make it guaranteed crit direct. So it feels good to hit that button. Okay, now I think the melee synergy attack is pretty self-explanatory. Right? So let me illustrate the range synergy attack. Now here's a basic illustration of the range synergy attack on an MAS arena. So imagine if the carbuncle is on the north end of the arena, the player's on the south end. The range synergy attack, basically, the player and the carbuncle will each create an aether energy ball and fire that energy ball at each other. Those 2 energy balls will collide midway and explode into an AoE at the midpoint between the carbuncle and the player. Now you might be wondering, where the hell did you get this idea from? What can I say? Iron Man 2, right? That's the ending. Now, by these skill descriptions, right? Many of you already get what I'm going for. The concept is basically, when you want to use the melee synergy attack, the summoner and pet must be basically on top of each other. And for example, maybe the melee synergy attack, the animation is, the carbuncle jumps on the top of the summoner's head. Super cute, I think. And then the summoner offers arcane energy aether energy for the pet from the summoner book. And then the pet gathers the energy in front of its mouth, and carbuncle blasts the foe in the face, right? For example. And how do you perform this melee synergy attack? You have options, right? I've added those extra skills. You can teleport to your pet to perform this melee synergy attack. You can teleport. You can maybe run up to your pet, perform the melee synergy attack, and then save those movement utility skills for boss mechanics. You can, teleport the pet away so that you can then perform the range synergy attack. And the idea behind this is to really give the player a lot of freedom to position the pet. Don't forget that the pet is constantly pulsing, is either melee or range mode, constantly pulsing a circle around itself or a cone at whatever the summoner targets. And so if you can look at the system and see how much flexibility it has for a player to adjust based on mechanics. And that in itself is, once again, really interesting gameplay with a mastery ceiling for vets who are willing to think about how to optimize this type of style. Alright, so let's look at this. Let's apply pet synergy to an MAS clear by Mr. Happy. Once again, he streams the game, clears all the savages. Great guy. Now, as you can see, the boss is in the middle. So we can start off with putting the carbuncle right in the middle in melee mode. So melee mode, the carbuncle is doing, a circular ring attack all around itself. And the boss jumps to the left of the screen, right? So now if you imagine the carbuncle is now out of position, it's not doing the most damage it can be. So as a player, you can move that carbuncle, right? You can move it towards the position that the boss has moved. Now in this case, for example, let's imagine we're in the position of Mr. Happy, we gotta move towards the top right of the screen, right? But once again, the pet carbuncle, we gotta move that as well for damage. So we move the carbuncle to where the boss new position is. Now, obviously it's still on top of the boss, so we keep it in melee mode. And okay, so now, so for example, yeah, so the boss dashes across the screen. And now, obviously, once again, the pet is in melee mode, out of position. So we gotta fix that, right? So we switch the pet. We switch the pet to range mode. Alright, so as you can see, this involves a bit of thinking on the player's part to how to get the most damage out of pet. Now you might be asking, where are the synergy attacks, right? This is an example of a synergy attack, don't worry. That's coming up. Alright, so we've switched the pet to range mode now to make sure it keeps doing damage, right? We don't want the boss just dash across the whole arena. We don't want to have to move the pet all the way across, right? That's a loss of damage, and we're trying to optimize damage. Alright, so the pet is still on the opposite side of the arena, shooting range attacks, okay? So now Mr. Happy in this case, he's moved back to mid, but let's say if we're a summoner and we have to execute a synergy attacks, what can we do, right? What can we do in this situation? Now, as you say, the pet's, as I mentioned, the pet is still in that position. It was originally doing range attacks. So, unlike Mr. Happy, we can, for example, keep standing on the edge of the arena over here, on the bottom right of the screen. And then we perform the range synergy attack. Bam, right in the middle. That's 1200 potency right there, right? And then we can think of, okay, what do we do next? How can we maybe get off a melee synergy attack? Alright, so let's remove that. And then we move the pet, alright? We can move the pet back to mid. Maybe we can use the pet teleport skill, so that's quicker. We move the pet mid, switch it to melee mode. And now it's on top of the boss again, raiding pulsing the melee AoE damage around the carbuncle. And you as a player, for example, you can run on top of the carbuncle, or teleport on top of the carbuncle. Now you're on top of each other, you perform the melee synergy attack. Bam, there, right? So that's an example of how you might use these skills in a real fight. Now I can't say for certain that how the battle content, how Fight Savage will be designed in the future, but assuming they keep going this path, this kind of pet management, pet synergy gameplay will be very interesting and impactful in content. So by now I hope you can see what I'm going for, right? With the 4 ideas I've provided. There's an emphasis on player choice, player flexibility, skill expression, based on the fight knowledge. At the same time, it still is a very easy rotation. You're summoning Bahamut, you're summoning 3 elemental primals, and then you summon Bahamut, and while doing all that, occasionally you might throw in a synergy attack base, and you might have to manage your pet so that you're in position to perform those synergy attacks. And it's very meaningful, very impactful, pretty easy to understand, I think. And for casual player, you can always be lazy, positioning your pet in a very static manner. You can ignore the elemental bonus because it's not that. I mean, at best it's like 4% extra damage. If you're lazy, you can ignore it and not grief your average party in Duty Finder. So I think this is personally, I think it's pretty good, right? I don't know. You tell me what you think about these ideas. Okay, so you might recall that I mentioned the 5th idea. And the 5th idea, I called it elemental modification. Now, I must say this idea is a bit extreme. And I don't think it's in any way casual friendly. But I might as well lay out that idea just for fun, right? Since we've already thrown out so many ideas, why not? Right, so the idea behind this is basically the attack of a primal skill changes based on what is summoned before it. Alright? So let me just lay it out very simply. Let's say you summon Garuda first. And then, so what if you summon Shiva after Garuda? Let's say if the normal attack for Shiva is an Ice Shard attack. If you summon Shiva after Garuda, the Ice Shard attack becomes a Hellstorm attack. Or if you summon Ramu after Garuda, a normal Thunderbolt attack becomes Electrostorm. Because the lightning mixes with the wind, right? You get what I mean? You get what I'm going for? Or if it's Leviathan after Garuda, a simple water spell attack becomes a water tornado. Titan, Mountain Buster becomes a jagged Stone Edge You throw a Stone Edge, Jagged Stone Edge attack. And if it, maybe a normal Fire Breath becomes Wildfire Inferno. These are just examples. So the idea behind this is, right, all these new attacks, transformed, modified elemental attacks, will have their own utility, potency, cast time, so on. Right? So, and they will effectively have their own unique uses depending on the situation. Now, obviously, by now you might be looking at this and thinking, this is way too much, right? Because you have 6 primals, and all the attacks get modified based on what primal is before that. I mean, that's like 30 different attacks, right? That's way too much. Acknowledge, which is why I mentioned before, this idea is pretty extreme. And yeah, this idea is complex, but I mean, hey, it's interesting, so I threw it out. Maybe it's something that, when Final Fantasy is at its end, maybe the devs will just do this, maybe the devs can consider this idea just to make it crazy fun, crazy ridiculous, right? Now, on a side note, I must say, imagine if someone made a mod that did this, that changed the animation of a primal skill based on what's summoned after, right? So, for example, if a player summons Titan after he crit, maybe the Titan attack becomes Molten Lava. Maybe you can have a mod that, even though it's just cosmetic, maybe a lot of players will love a mod like that. Who knows? So anyway, all right. So that that's it for me. Thanks for watching my first video, and if you've gone through the whole video, thanks a lot. And if you're interested in more Final Fantasy wishlist ideas or whatever random, Final Fantasy XIV video idea I might come up with in the future, please do subscribe. That helps grow the channel. But honestly, beyond that, most of all, please, I would love it if people share this video with other players who wish for some of the gameplay to be more interesting. Because if more players watch this video, a bit more traction, that leads to Creative Studio 3 seeing this video, and potentially they might look at the feedback. They might not take the ideas I've come up with, because I'm not a game dev. Once again, I'm not a game dev. I don't know if these ideas are actually workable, applicable in the game. But if those devs can see these ideas, they see my thinking behind it, and use it to adjust some of the class, I would be pretty excited for 8.0 Summoner. Alright, so thanks for watching. That's it from me, and I hope everyone keeps on enjoying playing the game.